Ever think about how a country with over 1 billion people actually governs itself?
Oh, absolutely.
It's mind-boggling, right?
Yeah.
Talk about complicated.
Yeah.
Well, that's what makes today's deep dive so interesting.
Okay.
We're diving into the world of India's parliament.
All right.
And get this, our source material is an Indian civics textbook.
Interesting. You might not think a textbook would be a page turner,
Right.
but trust me, this one has it all.
Okay.
Political maneuvering, power struggles,
Yeah.
and those all important checks and balances that keep things from going completely off the rails.
Exactly. And it all starts with understanding that their government, it's structured a little differently than what we might be used to here.
Right.
It's a parliamentary system.
Okay.
So that means that the prime minister and their cabinet, the ones actually running things, they need the support of the Lok Sabha to stay in power.
So think of the Lok Sabha kind of like the House of Representatives in the U.S. system.
Good.
It's the part of parliament directly elected by the people.
Gotcha.
And that constant need to maintain the Lok Sabha's support,
Yeah.
it creates a fascinating dynamic.
Almost like a high-stakes game of political chess.
Precisely. And speaking of chess,
Yeah.
India's parliament doesn't have just one board, they have two.
Oh, interesting.
They have the Lok Sabha, which we just talked about, but
Yeah.
they also have the Rajya Sabha.
Okay, 2 houses of parliament. So is this where it gets really complicated?
Well, it might seem similar to the U.S. system with its House and Senate on the surface.
Okay.
But the way India's Rajya Sabha is structured, it's fundamentally different.
How so?
It all comes down to how they represent the states.
All right, so walk me through this. How does the Rajya Sabha represent the states differently?
Okay, so in the U.S. Senate, every state, no matter how big or small, gets 2 senators.
Right.
But in India, the Rajya Sabha, it reflects the population size of each state,
Okay.
giving more populous states a proportionally stronger voice.
Makes sense.
For example, you've got a state like Uttar Pradesh,
Yeah.
huge population.
Right.
They're going to have way more representation in the Rajya Sabha than a smaller state like Sikkim.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That way, a state's influence in the Rajya Sabha, it's tied to how many people it represents. But what's the advantage of having 2 houses in the first place? Isn't that just adding like an extra layer of complexity?
You've hit on a debate that has surrounded bicameral legislatures for centuries.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The idea is that having that second house, in this case the Rajya Sabha, it acts like a second thought mechanism.
So like a safeguard against hasty decisions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Lok Sabha, with its direct elections,
Right.
it might be driven by more immediate public sentiment, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas the Rajya Sabha, representing the states with those staggered terms, they can provide a more measured long-term perspective.
Okay.
They can, like, pump the brakes on legislation if needed.
I see. It's a way to balance things out a little bit. But let's be honest. When most people think about Parliament, they probably picture those dramatic debates about laws.
Sure, that's definitely a part of it.
Yeah.
But what often gets overlooked is that Parliament's role is so much bigger than just enacting laws.
Okay.
They have a ton of power,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to keeping a check on the government spending.
Okay, let's talk money then.
Yeah.
How does the Parliament actually exert its influence over how the government spends?
Well, think of it this way. The government can't just introduce new taxes or start spending willy-nilly.
Right.
They need the Lok Sabha's approval for all that.
So it's like a constant back and forth, you know, keeping each other in check.
Precisely. This financial control is so crucial because it makes sure the government can't just make huge financial decisions without answering to, you know, the people they represent.
Right, right.
It's all about transparency and making sure things are being run responsibly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But it sounds like Parliament has even bigger weapons in its arsenal than just budget battles.
Oh, absolutely. The Lok Sabha can actually initiate what's called a no-confidence motion.
Okay, no confidence motion.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of intense.
It is. Basically, if the Lok Sabha decides they don't have confidence in the government for any reason at all, they can start this motion. And if it passes, the government, they have to resign.
Wow. Talk about a power move.
And the thing is, this isn't just some theoretical possibility. It's actually happened multiple times in India's history,
Oh, wow.
which just goes to show you how much power this really gives the parliament.
That's fascinating. So we've got control over the money and this looming threat of a no confidence motion.
Yeah.
What other tools does Parliament have?
Well, there's this thing called question hour.
Question hour.
Yeah, and I know it doesn't sound very exciting,
Right.
but it's actually one of the most powerful tools they have. Yeah. Every single day, members of parliament, They get to directly question government ministers on any topic they want.
Wait, so they can just grill them on the spot?
Exactly. It's a chance to demand accountability, get into the nitty-gritty of how policies are actually playing out in the real world.
I bet those sessions get pretty interesting.
You could say that.
Like a live-action accountability session.
It's really a cornerstone of their whole democratic process.
Okay, so we've talked about how Parliament keeps an eye on government spending, how they even have a say in whether the government stays in power.
Right.
But what about the actual lawmaking process? How does an idea actually become law in this system?
It's pretty fascinating and actually more complicated than you might think.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It's not as simple as just, getting a majority vote in the Lok Sabha and calling it a day.
Okay, so walk me through it. What are the steps?
So it all starts with a bill, which is essentially a draft of a proposed law.
Okay,
And this bill can be introduced in either house of the parliament.
gotcha. So what happens next?
This is where those committees we mentioned earlier come into play. They basically act as miniature legislatures, examining the bill in detail, debating it, often making changes and amendments.
So it's like there's a whole other layer of scrutiny and debate going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. And it's in these committees where you see the real impact of coalition.
Coalition governments, right. Remind me how those work again.
So in India, it's pretty common for no single party to win a majority in the Lok Sabha.
Okay.
This leads to these coalition governments forming where multiple parties have to work together.
Gotcha. So how does that impact things when it comes to making laws?
Well, imagine trying to get a bill passed that needs to make multiple different parties happy,
Yeah.
each with their own priorities and agendas.
That sounds like a recipe for getting absolutely nothing done.
It can be, but it also forces compromise and collaboration.
Right.
The textbook uses the example of the Lokpal bill.
Okay.
This bill, it was all about creating an anti-corruption ombudsman. And this thing, it faced delays, it faced hurdles,
Yeah.
and it really illustrates the complexities of trying to get laws made in a system with multiple parties.
So it's all about balance, trying to navigate all those viewpoints and somehow find common ground.
Exactly. And it's in this intricate dance of negotiation and debate and compromise that you really see the heart of how India's parliament works.
It really makes you realize there's so much more going on beneath the surface than just those, headline-grabbing debates you see.
Wow, for sure.
Like a political thriller happening in slow motion.
Exactly. And sometimes those things happening behind the scenes, they're just as important, if not more so, than the big public spectacle of it all.
Speaking of those debates, things can get pretty heated in the Lok Sabha, right?
Wow, absolutely. The textbook even mentions how passionate things can get,
Right.
which kind of makes you wonder, how do they keep things from becoming completely chaotic?
Yeah, with that much passion flying around, it seems like things could easily go off the rails.
Yeah. Well, there are a few things that help keep everyone in line and maintain some sense of order. One of them is this concept of parliamentary privilege.
Okay, parliamentary privilege. What is that?
Basically, it means members of parliament, they have a lot of protection for what they say during those debates.
Mm.
They're free to be critical, to disagree, even if what they're saying is unpopular or controversial.
So it's like a shield then. It lets them speak freely without worrying about getting sued or something.
Exactly. It's all about making sure they can have these really open and honest discussions, which, let's face it, are super important for a democracy to actually work.
Right, of course.
But,
Yeah.
with great power comes great responsibility, right?
There's always a trade-off. So how do they make sure this parliamentary privilege isn't abused?
That's where the rules of parliamentary procedure come in.
Okay,
The Speaker of the House, they have a lot of authority to keep things in check.
makes sense.
And there are procedures for dealing with anyone who breaks the rules. And actually, speaking of rules,
Yeah.
the textbook brought up this really interesting law, the anti-defection law.
Anti-defection law. What is that?
So remember how we were talking about coalition governments
Yeah.
and how important it is for those alliances to actually hold together?
Right.
Well, this law, it's designed to stop politicians from switching sides after they've been elected.
So no more party hopping. I can see how that would be important, especially if you're trying to get big laws passed.
Exactly. But like with everything in politics,
Right.
there are always different opinions.
Of course.
This law, while it's meant to create stability, it's also caused some debate.
About?
Well, some people wonder if it gives too much power to party leaders over individual members.
Interesting. I can see that.
It brings up these questions about balancing loyalty to your party with, your own conscience and your duty to represent the people who voted for you.
It's that classic dilemma. How do you balance order with individual freedom? No easy answers there, huh?
Not at all. Which, in a way, that kind of sums up the whole dynamic at the heart of India's parliament and really any democracy, right? It's this constant balancing act, passionate debate versus getting things done,
Right, right.
recognizing the needs of the many, but also the rights of the few.
It really makes you appreciate how complicated it must be to govern a place as diverse and as vibrant as India.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we've covered so much from how their parliament is structured to how they actually make laws.
Yeah.
And we even got into all the fascinating power dynamics, both the stuff we see out in the open and all that behind the scenes maneuvering.
And to think, this all started with a simple civics textbook.
Yeah.
Goes to show you, you never know where these deep dives will take us.
That's what makes it so fun, though, right?
Yeah.
Always more to discover, always something new to learn.
Absolutely.
Speaking of which, we've covered a lot of ground here, but that textbook, it ended on a really thought-provoking note. Yeah, it asked this question: what's more important for the Lok Sabha, the part of the government that's supposed to be the voice of the people?
Yeah.
Should they focus on those really intense, sometimes kind of chaotic debates, the ones that really show just how different, or should they try to be more efficient, making sure that they can pass laws smoothly and effectively?
Wow, that's a tough one. There's no easy answer to that.
Exactly.
It's all about finding that balance, right? Too much of one, and you end up silencing people, ignoring what they have to say.
Yeah.
But too much of the other, and nothing gets done, people get frustrated.
It's like walking a tightrope trying to find that sweet spot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the big takeaway here.
Yeah.
There's no one right way to do things, no perfect system. It's about adapting, being flexible, figuring out how to make those voices heard while still working towards the greater good,
Something for all of us to think about. Well, on that note, we'll leave you with this. If you were a member of India's parliament, how would you balance the need for passionate debate with that responsibility of actually governing effectively? It's something to chew on until our next deep dive. Until then, keep those brains buzzing.